I am 90 years old, and if there's something that still bothers me today, it's not what I lived through. It's what I failed to notice while everything seemed normal. For decades, I believed I knew my family. I believed I understood the people around me, and it was exactly that certainty that blinded me. My name is Walter Harrington, and what I discovered recently wasn't something that appeared suddenly. It was something that had always been there, hidden in small details I chose to ignore. The problem is, when you spend your life avoiding certain questions, the answers don't disappear. They just wait. Today I understand that some truths don't come to set you free. They come to show you how much you accepted, living without truly seeing. And if you think this could never happen to you, that might be exactly why you need to hear what I'm about to tell you. For most of my life, everything seemed to follow a predictable pattern. My family looked like any other from the outside. Gatherings on important dates, polite conversations at the table, and that comfortable sense of belonging. There were no major conflicts, no obvious breaks. And for a long time, I believed that meant harmony. I built my perception on what was visible, on what was said, and most of all on what was never questioned. There was an unspoken agreement between all of us. Don't disturb what seems to be working. Small discomforts were quickly ignored, and any doubt was treated as an overreaction of my own mind. As the years went by, I began to notice certain details that didn't quite fit. Looks that lasted a little longer than they should, conversations that shifted when I got closer, vague answers to simple questions. But instead of investigating, I did what I had always done. I moved on. The truth is, there is a dangerous kind of peace in not wanting to know too much. I told myself I was preserving harmony, that some things didn't need to be explored. And so, without realizing it, I grew used to a version of reality that was comfortable, but not necessarily true. Now, looking back, I see that the normality I defended so strongly was built on absences. It wasn't what happened that should have concerned me, but everything that was never said. And it was within that constant silence that the foundation of everything began to form without me even suspecting it. If I had to point to a specific moment, I would say it all began in a way that was almost imperceptible. It was an ordinary afternoon at home with no apparent tension at all. A simple question was asked, one of those that usually carries no weight, but the answer I received didn't match what I already knew. It wasn't a serious mistake, but it wasn't something that could go unnoticed either. In that instant, something inside me recognized the inconsistency. It was quick, almost automatic, like a faint discomfort you feel and immediately try to ignore. I could have asked more. I could have pressed a little further, but I chose not to. I convinced myself it wasn't worth creating discomfort over something so small. Over time, other similar moments began to appear. Small discrepancies, details that didn't quite align, subtle changes in the behavior of the people around me. But since I had already decided back then not to dig into that first signal. Everything that followed became filtered through that same choice. There is a kind of silent mechanism that sets in when you decide to ignore something important. You begin to reinterpret reality to maintain a sense of control, adjusting the pieces so everything continues to make sense, even when, deep down, it no longer does. And that's exactly what I did, without realizing how much it would cost me. Today, I understand that the problem was never that first moment itself. The problem was the decision I made there, not to look more closely. Because when you ignore the first sign, you're not avoiding a problem. You're simply allowing it to grow in silence. After that first moment, something changed, but not outside of me, rather in the way I dealt with what I saw. I began to recognize the signs, but at the same time, I developed a dangerous ability to explain them away quickly. There was always a ready justification, a convenient interpretation, something that allowed me to move forward without digging deeper. As the years went by, those situations stopped being occasional and began to happen more frequently. Conversations that were cut short when I arrived, shifts in behavior around certain topics, decisions made without really including me. Nothing was explicit enough to create confrontation, but it wasn't insignificant either. I kept telling myself that this was just part of any family dynamic, that not everything needed to be shared, that everyone had their own space, their own reasons, and in a way that was true. The problem is that I started using those explanations not to understand better, but to avoid seeing clearly. There comes a point where repetition begins to exact a silent cost. You don't notice it right away, but something inside you starts drifting away from your own perception. You stop trusting what you feel, begin to doubt your own impressions, and little by little, you lose the ability to distinguish what is normal from what is being hidden. When I finally realized it, it was no longer about isolated moments. It was a pattern. And patterns don't appear out of nowhere. They are built over time, fed by every moment you chose not to question. That's how I maintained a sense of peace, while without realizing it, I was drifting away from the truth. There was a man I met many years ago, someone I would occasionally talk to at a cafe near my home. He wasn't close to me, but he liked to talk about his life as if he were trying to organize his thoughts out loud. One day, without any warning, he told me he had discovered something about his own family after decades, something that had always been right in front of him. He said that for a long time he noticed small signs but never had the courage to look deeper. He preferred to hold on to the idea that everything was fine because that made life feel lighter. But, according to him, that lightness was only superficial. Underneath it, there was a constant unease he could never fully explain. What stayed with me the most from that conversation wasn't exactly what he discovered, but the way he described the moment. He talked about the realization that he hadn't been deceived all at once, but gradually, with his own participation. He said the hardest part wasn't facing the truth, but accepting the time he had lost by avoiding it. At the time, I listened carefully, but kept a certain emotional distance. I thought that story said more about his life than mine. After all, my reality seemed stable, controlled, predictable. I didn't see myself in that situation, nor did I imagine there was any parallel between us. Today, looking back, I realized that conversation wasn't random. It was a warning, perhaps the clearest one I could have received. But warnings only make sense when you're willing to recognize them. And at that time, I was still too committed to maintaining my own version of reality intact. The day everything changed didn't seem extraordinary at first. It was an ordinary morning, at home, with the same routine as always. I was looking for an old document in a drawer. I almost never opened something simple with no expectations at all. That's when I found something that shouldn't have been there, or maybe something that had always been there, but had never been seen. At first, I didn't fully understand what I was looking at. It was a small detail, but it carried implications that didn't make immediate sense. I felt a kind of physical discomfort, as if my body had understood it before my mind did. I stood still for a few seconds, trying to organize it into a logic that didn't yet exist. As I began connecting the pieces, a sequence of memories started to surface with a clarity I had never experienced before. Old situations, unfinished conversations, reactions I had ignored, everything began to fall into place in a way I could no longer deny. What once felt like isolated moments now formed a continuous line. It didn't feel like a sudden shock, but rather a delayed recognition. It was like realizing something that had always been there, just waiting for the moment I could no longer ignore it. And in that instant, for the first time, I had no way to justify, soften, or reinterpret what was in front of me. That's when I understood I wasn't dealing with a mistake or a misunderstanding. I was facing a truth that had been built over years through silence, through omissions, and most of all, through my own decision not to look while there was still time. After that day, I spent hours trying to reorganize everything I thought I knew. It wasn't just about what I had discovered, but about what it meant within my own story. And in that process, I realized something even more uncomfortable. The problem wasn't only what had been hidden, it was the entire foundation on which I had built my trust. Throughout my life, I believed in a very simple idea. If there is no conflict, then there is truth. I associated silence with peace, the absence of confrontation with harmony, and that gave me a false sense of security for decades. That was the great lie that guided my decisions without me even realizing it. The truth is, silence protects nothing when it hides what needs to be seen. It only delays the inevitable while creating a parallel reality where everything seems to be in place until it no longer is. And when that structure begins to collapse, you realize you weren't just misled by others, you were, above all, misled by the choices you made. If I had to summarize this in a single sentence, it would be this: avoiding the truth doesn't preserve relationships. It only prolongs an illusion that one day demands the full price. And that price is almost never paid at the right time. It comes late, when there is no longer enough time to rebuild with clarity. The hardest part to accept wasn't what I discovered about my family. It was understanding that I had spent my entire life confusing comfort with truth. And when you live like that long enough, reality stops being something you observe and becomes something you simply accept without question. Sometime later, I remembered a woman who worked with me for years. She always seemed calm, discreet, someone who avoided conflict at all costs. One day, when she was older, she told me she had spent decades pretending not to notice certain behaviors within her own family. She said she believed she was preserving unity, but in the end she realized she was only prolonging a silent distance. She described how small things started to bother her, but never enough to spark a direct conversation. Over time, those details accumulated until they became impossible to ignore. When she finally decided to face reality, there was no longer any room to rebuild what had been lost. The problem wasn't just what happened, it was everything that had been left unsaid over the years. It was impossible not to see myself in that story. I began to realize it wasn't about a single event or a specific discovery, but about a pattern I had repeated throughout my life. I avoided immediate discomfort, believing I was making the most sensible choice, without realizing I was accumulating much greater consequences for the future. After that, something changed in the way I observed things. I started paying attention to what isn't said, to what is avoided, to the small signs I used to ignore so easily. Not because that solves everything, but because for the first time I understood that seeing early may not prevent pain, but it prevents it from turning into a lifetime of illusion. I'm 90 years old, and if there's one thing I can still tell you with clarity, it's this. The truth doesn't destroy as much as the time you lose avoiding it. In the end, it wasn't what I discovered that hurt the most. It was realizing how long it had already been there. Now tell me, are you truly satisfied with the way you're living your relationships today? What have you been avoiding questioning, even though you feel something isn't right? And deep down, what do you know really matters, but keep putting off? If this message made sense to you, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who needs to hear this while there's still time. And subscribe to the channel, because some truths only arrive when we're willing to listen